Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video we're going to cover how Ben painted up the infantry for his Imperial Guard army. Now a few months ago we covered how he did the vehicles, and since then pretty much every week we're getting comments, oh how's he done the infantry, can you show us? Well yep, we've got some time, we've put the video together so you can see how he created it. Now Ben is a big fan of real world military history, so he did a bunch of research before settling on the scheme, and I believe his major source of inspiration was this kit worn by the Americans during the Vietnam War. It's not a direct copy, but as I say, it was the main inspiration for it. Now, Ben got this army painted in a weekend, so we're calling it a speed paint video, but that's something I'd like to discuss at the end of this tutorial. So let's paint. I've followed Ben's notes more or less to the letter, and for the first base coat we're going to use Games Workshop Deathcore Drab. Now I've airbrushed this on for the base coat, but you absolutely don't need an airbrush to do this scheme. You can just hand paint this on, or if you can find a rattle can that's very close colour, you could use that instead. I obviously have the airbrush, so I'm using that to get the base coat down because it's just more efficient for me. Now for our armour colour, we're going to do a 50-50 mix, so 1 drop of Deathcore Drab for every 1 drop of Straken Green paint, both by Games Workshop. It's both easy to get hold of. Now I've tried to leave in as much of the painting footage as possible for this scheme to give you an idea. I have sped it up, because I don't want the video to be overly long. But you can see here, it's all brush highlights we're going on with. It's a relatively dilute mix. I would say I've diluted this mix on my wet palette, probably close to 1 drop of water for each drop of the mix. So it would be 1 drop water, 1 drop Straken Green, 1 drop Deathcore Drab, something like that. But you're going to need to adjust that for how you work and how you paint. And the reason I've done that is so that as I put the paint on, I'm going to draw my brush towards where I want the highlights to be. And as I take my brush away, it's going to deposit most of the paint in that area. So it will just create a really rough, really quick blend across the areas that we're painting here. So we're going for the armour and we're going for the gaiters with this. The Deathcore Drab base coat is really important to this scheme because it's essentially the base coat for all the different elements. You see, by the time I'd got round the sort of 4 or 5 different areas of the model that I was doing this on, the first area is dry, so I can go back in and apply a second coat. And I just work in a slightly smaller area than I did before, but still moving my brush in the same direction. And again, this will just deposit a little bit more paint towards the lightest area. It's just a very efficient way of creating that nice transition with our brush. And here you can see what I was talking about with the dilution of the paint. If I can just get my thumb in focus, might be even better. Fiddling around with the buttons, we're nearly there. There we go. So you can get an idea. So you're not expecting to get a solid colour with one pass here. But equally, it's not taking very long at all to get this on the model and done. Now with that same mix, so that 50-50 mix, we're going to use a less diluted version of it, and we're going to pretty much base coat all the webbing on the armour, so the backpack and all the straps, things like that. I'm leaving the Deathcore Drab in the darkest recesses because we're not actually going to go and sling a wash or anything over this model. Again, because it's the same mix, it's nice and efficient, it's still on the palette. Now the final stage for the armour is adding a little Screaming Skull into that 50-50 mix just to lighten it up a bit. And you can see here I'm doing a few sort of odd edge highlights. By no means on all the panels at all, just on areas where I think it's going to catch the light and catch the eye. You're probably talking about it taking you 30 seconds or something like that on the model. It does make a really big difference. I also appreciate that I am painting this model for a tutorial. I'm not sat here painting the 50 or whatever it was that Ben got done in the weekend. But I got to admit, I had an awful lot of fun following this scheme and doing it. And as you become more and more familiar with the miniatures, this speeds up as well. I've only painted, 11 guardsmen. ever. And that was all since they got that release. Was it end of last year or earlier this year? But whenever they got that enormous great release. I'd never painted a guardsman model before. There I am diligently highlighting some of those pockets, which I later discover are actually part of the clothing, not the webbing. So I'm going to go back and paint those differently later. And we're using that same mix to do a much bigger highlight on the straps and on the bags and whatnot. So rather than just like with the armor panels where we just did a few little line highlights, you can see here we're applying it over a much greater area. I've included all of the exact colours that Ben has used for this scheme, so if people want to copy it exactly, then they can. But he wanted to point out, and I think I often do when we do these types of videos, is if you have similar paints, you do not need to go out and buy the exact ones. The highlight colour we've used to mix in, and at this point we've just added more of that Screaming Skull in now to do a final highlight on the straps and the webbing and whatnot. The reason we've chosen Screaming Skull is it's this sort of yellowy bone colour that will lighten up the green. If we had just used white or something like ivory or a very light grey, it would take away the colour too much. It would desaturate it, and it wouldn't just... I mean, it looks great. I did it on the test model and I really liked it, but it's not what Ben did. He deliberately chose that slightly yellowy green to highlight it with to try and keep it more of a similar tone to what was underneath. And for the clothing, speaking of mixes, this mix here is, let me get this right, it is 2 parts Deathcore Drab to 1 part Vallejo light green to 1 part Vallejo dark sea blue. Both of those are model colours. Now that might seem like rather a complicated mix, and I'm inclined to agree. Ben has painted a lot, and we're talking possibly thousands of guard miniatures, certainly hundreds and hundreds of guard miniatures. So for him, the mix was absolutely fine. It got him the colour he wanted. If you just want to grab something off the shelf, something like Sons of Horus Green by Games Workshop isn't a million miles away. As you can see here, this is a clip from a recent Patreon video Andy's been doing where he's been working on the Farsight base. He's just finished that model today, actually, as of recording. I think it's a 4-part series, multi-hour series. It's absolutely awesome. And I've just stuck it in there because I just want to say thanks ever so much for the support you give us over on Patreon. It allows us to produce those longer format videos over on there, and also allows us to produce stuff on here on YouTube every week. And without that, we simply couldn't do it. So massive thank you from us for that support. Now to highlight that mix, we're just going to add a little bit more of the light green blue into it. And you can see I've only left the Deathcore Drab in the very, very darkest recesses. And then for this highlight, we're going fairly broad with it. We're not worrying about doing perfect blends or anything like that, but just sticking it where we think it would catch the light. And that's all we're going to do for the clothing. For the black parts, so the boots, the weapons, things like, the lasgum casing. If you've got any little knife scabbards on the belts, things like that, we're just going to base coat it black. I'm using Vallejo model color black, but you use whatever you like. And then you're going to add in a lighter grey color to get that. Now, Ben said he deliberately mixed in a slightly warmer grey here. I have used Pro Acryl warm grey, I believe it's called, light warm grey, because that's perfect. But just something that's that little bit warmer, just again so it doesn't mess around with that main colour that's on the model. So I want to be really accurate and tell you exactly what Ben's used, but don't get bogged down too much. Now, Ben wanted to apply a little bit of camo to the model because it looks cool, but as we've said in previous guard videos, you do camo all over. It either is really well done and therefore works like camouflage, you can't read the model properly, or it just looks a bit daft. But just doing the helmet was a great way to get a little bit of camo on the model without it being distracting. So those two photos I showed before were the sort of inspiration for it. Now we're going to base coat the helmet using Straken Green, just on its own. So I think it took me 3 coats to just get a nice smooth base coat on the helmet. Then you're going to do some random blobs using MIG green base, or sort of a goblin-y green colour. I love how quick this comes together, this scheme as well. So a few blobs of that. Then we're going to use some smaller blobs, this time Vallejo model colour black green. And these little blobs I'm making sure overlap the 2 different areas of green that we've got on the model, or on the helmet. Now Ben should be in the chat at the moment if you're watching this video on Premiere, so please do ask him any questions that you've got about the scheme. And once we've done a few of those, the final stage is going to be adding 3 to 4 of these little squiggly Ys, basically. We're using Mournfang Brown to paint them in. It's just a squiggly Y shape. I think it was more or less at this point I messaged Ben being like, I really want to paint Guard. There's so much character in these models, and the schemes are they're a lot of fun to do. Then for the skin, in Ben's notes it's just paint the skin however you like. I thought I'd put in a little bit more detail, so this is how I like to do really quick skin. For instance, this is a very quick recipe for Caucasian skin. If you search back through our YouTube videos and many of our Patreon videos as well, we cover painting skin a lot because it's a lot of fun, but also, depending on the miniatures you're painting, there's often quite a lot of it to paint. But this is a very quick way of doing it. We just use Night Questor, and then over the top of that we highlight with Cadian Fleshtone. And that's all I've done on the face as well. Very effective at the sort of 3 foot distance, which is exactly what we're painting this to be viewed at. Then for the metallic areas, we've used a dark silver metallic. This is by Pro Acryl. And there's only, a handful of bits on the model that you're going to be painting in this anyway. But you notice something where I'm always making sure I leave some of that darker colour around what we're painting, because say we're not going to wash it, so we want that little bit of definition, that little bit of separation that's created by wherever possible leaving that slightly darker deathcore drab between the colours. And then just to add a tiny bit of interest to the metals, Ben has watered down contrast Black Templar, and he's using that like a wash. He's a big fan of using the contrasts as washes rather than the washes. Now ignore the base, I just had to get a brown base on there. But the last thing Ben did was blat it all with a bit of ultra matte varnish. I actually thought it looked really nice without the matte varnish on. That's how I'd have left it if it was mine. But he did do matte varnish on them, so that's what I'm doing here. Now the bases, I'll put a link up. It's exactly how we do nearly all our bases on YouTube, and I will put the 2 products that he's used for it down in the description. But that is it, and here's the Guardsman done. Huge amount of fun. Now I've said this before, particularly on our speed painting videos, it's not really meant to be viewed, this miniature, blown up on a screen, hyper detailed, but we are going to show that. But also I'm going to drop in here a bunch of photos of Ben's army, sort of in situ as it were, so you can see the effect. I think it's absolutely wicked. Now there is definitely an argument here which I've had with Ben, and I suspect we may get in the comments about, is this speed painting? We think it is speed painting. Speed painting is going to be different for every person. Is this as quick as just doing a base coat and then a wash all over, or dry brushing the miniature up, or doing something like slap chop? No, it isn't as quick as that. But you're going to have an awful lot more control. You're going to have more decisions to make about colours, and just more options with your painting. And we kind of assume that if you follow us at Cult of Paint, then you like painting. And we're just trying to show different ways that maybe you can enjoy it more. All of us here paint armies for gaming. We paint armies to be sort of shelf queens, as it were. You know, we don't mind if they only get 1 or 2 games a year. They're just to look pretty on the shelf and make us smile. And we paint display level, competition level miniatures as well. And we find that, you can't paint every model the same way, but you can enjoy painting at all those different levels. So I think it's finding for you what works, what you're willing to compromise with, which part of the process you enjoy. Is it the creating the scheme? Is it applying the paint? Is it the finished job itself? What's important to you? And as I said, Ben got that entire box done, the CADIA stands box done, in a weekend. So it's a very quick way of painting. He's able to paint that quickly because he's a commission artist of over a decade and has painted thousands, if not tens of thousands of miniatures. So he will have a little bit of that innate sort of speed anyway, swapping colours over, creating colours, applying the paint. But we believe this scheme is easy to replicate and can be done very efficiently and very quickly. So I hope you've enjoyed it. As I said, we get asked about it a lot. And it is fabulous. I'd like to feature Ben's army in a later video because he's done his Krieg and his Cadians to complement each other in that he can use the armour elements in both armies with it looking good. So that's something I want to talk to you about at a later date. So if you've got any questions about this scheme, any questions about alternative paints, things like that, pop them down in the comments. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks ever so much for the support. I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com and maybe Ben can sort you out.